Hello, everyone. If everyone would be seated, we're going to begin. Thank you.
We're delighted to see so many of you here. This is going to be an incredible AAMC annual meeting. Judith was just saying we'll never be able to top it, but we will hope to at least match it in the future. I'm Helen Evans, as I think most of you know, the president of the AAMC, and it would be a great pleasure for me to introduce Gary Tinterow, director of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts and host to this year's AAMC annual conference at any time. But this year is very special. The AAMC is 15 years old, and Gary was a leading force in our founding. I'm not sure how much he wants to remember it because he's done so much more, but he really was. As a quiet member of the founding group at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I remember the dynamism with which Gary set out to organize us, to get advice about our structure from Sharon Cott, the Met's top lawyer, to keep the Met's director then, Philippe de Montebello, aware of and supportive of our early development, and most importantly, to plan our future. And we owe him a great deal of appreciation for all he did. He did all of this at the Met as the museum's outstanding curator of 19th century art. He went on to head a new department of modern and contemporary art at the Met, and his exhibitions as a curator, like Manet Velasquez in 2002, were widely admired, as was, at least by most of us, I think all of us, his brilliant reinstallation of our modern galleries, where he cleverly wove together donors' demands, both living and dead. And he had lots of pressures on him, both from wills and from donors who could yell at him out loud, into what reads to those of us who still visit those galleries as a seamless whole. It's really one of the most brilliant installations getting around problems that I've ever seen. I just always am an amazing admirer of it. Now, as director of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Gary is leading a reimagining of an entire new museum, putting his innovative ideas and creativity to even greater use, as we can see as we tour the galleries this afternoon, this evening, and you should all look at all of them. He's returned home to Houston to make a great museum even greater. Normally, the president of the AAMC has the honor of thanking a host director with few ties to our organization for their generous support of our annual meeting. This year, it is really an amazingly greater honor to thank a former colleague, the founding president of AAMC, for his generous welcome of our organization in its 15th year of existence. We are celebrating as our motto this year, moving forward, in our effort to continue to make the curatorial profession relevant as Gary wanted it to be when he was president. We anticipate Gary seeing the events of this meeting and the others of the days of our conference as evidence that we are succeeding. So please join me in welcoming the first president of the AAMC and host of this year's annual conference as director of the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, Gary Tinterow.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's a real pleasure to see so many of you here, your 15th annual AAMC convention, but it gives me just enormous satisfaction to see you, to welcome you to my hometown and in this beautiful museum. 15 years ago, I was privileged to address many of you, and I recognize you, at our first convention at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Each of us and the entire curatorial profession have come a long way since then. A number of my colleagues and I, Helen was among them, Buffy, George Shackelford is probably here, Douglas Druick, many people across the country came together in 2001 in order to vote ourselves into existence and then to lay plans for a convention that was held at the Metropolitan in 2002, because we perceived a disturbing trend to minimize the role and authority of curators in museum practice. Recent reorganizations at several museums appear to segregate curators and to limit access to collections as well as programs. It seemed that search committees had become increasingly reluctant to consider curators as candidates for directorships. And I recall Agnes Gunn, who may hold the record for sitting on or advising museum search committees, saying that typically headhunters would come to the first meeting with 3 lists: the candidates whom you would want but could never get, the candidates who wanted the job but were problematic for one reason or another, and then there were the curators. But things have changed, and some of that change can be directly attributed to AAMC. Perhaps the most important tangible contribution AAMC has made was the creation by Buffy Easton and Agnes Gunn of the Center for Curatorial Leadership. Many who attended are now museum directors or museum executives, and that number has increased with each succeeding class. I know of many curators who are currently being considered for directorial positions, and I think we read every year about curators moving from curatorial to directorial ranks. And I notice that headhunters no longer wince or pause when I suggest curatorial names, when inevitably they call for suggestions. The once ubiquitous concern that museum administrations were becoming populated with people who did not believe in the primacy of art seems to have dissipated. Another important ambition of the AAMC was to define and support the curatorial profession. By discussing and publishing codes of conduct and best procedures, we wanted to ensure that curatorial practice remained at the core of every art museum. AAMC conventions and forums have proved invaluable in promoting consensus and high standards. Nevertheless, the rise of the internet and social media has created the illusion that anyone and everyone is an expert, eroding the position of genuine experts with decades of training and experience. The general distrust of establishment figures seems to me much more acute today than it was even in the heyday of 1960s radical politics. Just look at the current presidential primaries. And with it, curators have taken a hit. Many artists today insist on curating shows of their own work, relegating curators to administrative roles. Many commercial galleries organize ambitious exhibitions, often without curators, and always without the interpretive and educational programs that museums provide. And some museums have invited lay community figures, or indeed entire communities, to curate museum programs. Is this a fleeting fashion or evidence of a fundamental shift? My view is that it is an almost irreversible change. And I believe traditional curatorial practice is somewhat to blame. To the extent that we arrange displays and galleries for ourselves and our colleagues, to the extent that we write texts in obscure language and academic jargon, to the extent that we do not stop to engage a diverse audience that no longer reflects the culture of our own upbringings, we hasten the day when curators will lose the battle for control of the art and the mission of the museum. The Public Art Museum in America exists to serve the public interest, not our own parochial concerns, no matter how fascinating they may be. Curatorial authority rests on our ability to communicate with our public. If we turn back on that community, it will quickly turn its back on us. We fool ourselves to think that museums will thrive in perpetuity without a deep investment in our audience. I implore you to consider thoughtfully and then embrace your responsibility. It's easy to remain in your office or carrel and communicate with colleagues all over the world thinking you're advancing your career or your profession. But our future depends on our ability to communicate with the people in the galleries just outside our doors, not to mention those who have not even entered the building. That dialogue is essential, but it is immensely rewarding. Relish it, and you will propel our profession and museums into a glorious future. Thanks very much for coming to Houston.